No one had heard their names. They were neither wealthy nor engineers. But within them was a curiosity too vast for the earth to contain. With every failed attempt, they rose again. Every fall brought them one step closer to the sky. Until that morning, when history was written within the wind. Tonight, we will discover the story of Wilbur and Orville Wright, who opened the gates of the sky. Before moving to our video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share in the comments which city you're following us from. Now let's begin the journey of two brothers who gave wings to humanity. Wilbur Wright came into the world on April 16th, 1867, in the town of Millville, Indiana. 4 years later, on August 19th, 1871, his younger brother Orville was born in Dayton, Ohio. Their family was an ordinary American family, but their values were extraordinary. Their father, Milton Wright, was a Protestant bishop who traveled frequently and delivered sermons. He was a strict man, but never neglected to teach his children independent thinking. Their mother, Susan, was interested in mathematics and engineering and could make nearly anything with her own hands. She designed toys for her children, instilled curiosity, encouraged asking questions and exploring. The Wright family had 7 children, but there was a special bond between Wilbur and Orville. They were nearly inseparable. They played games, invented things, dreamed together. Wilbur was calmer, more thoughtful and theoretical. He loved engaging with books. Orville was more active, practical and bold. He took great pleasure in working with his hands. But the two formed a perfect team. They completed each other, covered each other's weaknesses. In 1878, when their father returned from a trip, he brought them a small toy. It was a simple helicopter model, designed by French aviation pioneer Alphonse Pénaud. It was made of bamboo and paper, powered by a rubber band. The children loved this toy and flew it for hours, watched it, examined it with curiosity. Then, inevitably, they took it apart, tried to understand how it worked, saw inside. And they began making their own versions, designed larger models. This small toy quietly changed their lives, ignited their interest in the sky, planted the dream of flight. Wilbur's youth seemed to herald a bright future, until that accident that changed everything one winter day. On a cold day in 1885, while playing ice hockey, a stick struck his face violently. His front teeth were broken, his jaw severely injured. He writhed in pain for months, but the real wound opened not in his body, but in his soul. He lost confidence in himself, withdrew, disconnected from life. His goal had once been to attend university, but he shelved all his plans. He took over the care of his sick mother Susan at home. As tuberculosis slowly consumed her, Wilbur quietly stayed by her side. When he lost his mother in 1889, his world collapsed once more. He was dragged into deep grief, endless despair. This dark period haunted him for years. But perhaps in that silence, the birth of an inventor was beginning to germinate. In the face of these hardships, the two brothers held each other even tighter and supported one another. Orville also didn't go to university, didn't complete formal education. Instead, he chose to pursue entrepreneurship, to start businesses. In 1890, they started a small printing business together. They printed newspapers, made brochures, did design work. Business was good, they were making money, but it wasn't exciting enough. Both were searching for something bigger, something more meaningful, a more challenging project. At that time in America and throughout the world, a new craze, a new trend had begun. Bicycle mania. Everyone was riding bicycles. Streets were filled with bicycles. Bicycle races were being organized. The Wright brothers also jumped on this trend and saw the opportunity. First, they rode bicycles themselves, participated in races. Then they started selling bicycles, provided repair services. In 1896, they officially established the Wright Cycle Company. They sold bicycles, repaired them, even produced their own designs, made custom bicycles. Business was successful, and they were earning good money. Customers were satisfied. But most importantly, they were gaining tremendous experience in mechanics, learning principles of balance and control. Bicycle repair gave them invaluable knowledge and practical experience in balance, control, and mechanical solutions. How is a bicycle kept balanced? How does a rider turn? How does he control? How does he move forward without falling? These questions and their answers would become vitally important in solving the problem of flight in the coming years. In August 1896, a famous German aviation pioneer named Otto Lilienthal had an accident while flying a glider and died. Lilienthal was a hero of aviation, a brave experimenter and pioneer. This tragic news deeply affected and made the Wright brothers think. Lilienthal had flown gliders for years, made more than 1,500 flights, soared in the sky. But he made a control error. The wind caught him violently, and he crashed to the ground. His last words before dying in the hospital were meaningful and tragic. Small sacrifices are necessary. This painful event rekindled Wilbur's old interest and practically set him ablaze. He was 31 years old and searching for meaning, a purpose in his life. The bicycle business was going well, but it wasn't satisfying his soul. The idea of flight fascinated him, completely occupied his mind, became almost an obsession. He went to the public library in Dayton and read everything he could find about aviation, researched. He carefully studied Otto Lilienthal's experimental work, read Samuel Langley's theoretical experiments, reviewed Octave Chanut's books repeatedly, and finally he reached an important conclusion. The problem could be solved. It wasn't impossible. Flight could be achieved. Only no one had yet found the right approach and method. In 1899, Wilbur Wright made a bold and historic decision. He went to Orville and said, "Let's solve the problem of flight together. Let's get into this." Orville was skeptical at first, considered the risks and hesitated. But when he saw his brother's determination and passion, he was convinced, found courage. His brother's excitement had infected him too. Thus the two began working together, embarked on research. They started by solving the problem. With a systematic, patient, and scientific approach, they broke flight into parts, reduced it to its essence. They knew 3 basic elements were needed for humans to rise into the sky: lift, thrust, and control. Lift was provided by wings. Its theory was partially understood. Thrust could be generated with an engine and propeller. This was also a solvable technical problem. But the real secret, the real struggle, was in control. How do you turn while flying? How do you stay balanced? How do you land safely? That was the whole issue. Most flight attempts ended in death for this reason. The Wright brothers were aware of this. They understood that if they wanted to conquer the sky, they first had to solve its balance. Previous aviators had focused on balance and stability. They tried to make the aircraft as stable, as self-balancing as possible. But the Wright brothers thought differently based on their bicycle experience. adopted a revolutionary approach. Control was more important than stability, more critical. A bicycle was inherently unstable, prone to tipping, but the rider kept it balanced by constantly actively controlling it. Perhaps an airplane should be the same. Perhaps the pilot should constantly actively control it. In the spring of 1900, they wrote an official letter to the Smithsonian Institution requesting information and literature about aviation. The institution sent them available books and articles. They voraciously read all available literature, took notes, and learned. Then they began conducting their own original experiments, moved from theory to practice. First, they built a small but functional wind tunnel in their workshop. They designed different wing shapes and profiles, made them from wood, and systematically tested them in the wind tunnel. Which shape provided more lift? Which angle was more efficient? Which profile was better? They conducted hundreds of patient tests and carefully, scientifically took notes. Then came the time to move from theory to practice, to test in the real world. They would build a full-scale glider and actually fly it. But where would they test it? Which place was suitable? They wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau, requesting information about places with constant, steady winds. The town of Kitty Hawk in North Carolina was recommended. There were sandy hills there, strong and steady winds blew, and almost no one lived there. It was an isolated place, a perfect testing site, an ideal laboratory. In September 1900, they made their first journey to Kitty Hawk. They brought their first glider in pieces with them. It was like a large kite, but could be controlled, directed. They tested tirelessly for weeks. They flew it in the wind, flew it from sandy hills, tried it in different conditions, and most importantly, they tested their control systems, their new ideas. Wilbur's revolutionary idea was the wing warping method. By bending, warping the wingtips with the help of wires, they could change the aircraft's direction and balance. This was a primitive but functional version of today's modern ailerons. The first season had passed promisingly. The tests were encouraging but still far from perfect. There were many problems. In 1901, the Wright brothers didn't give up, returned with a more advanced glider. This new model was bigger, more powerful, and the control system was much better than previous attempts. Throughout that year, they conducted hundreds of flight and gliding experiments. Sometimes they bravely climbed into the glider themselves and piloted. Sometimes for safety, they controlled from a distance. After each flight, they carefully kept notes, analyzed errors, and designed improvements for the next attempt. They disciplinedly applied the scientific method, first forming a hypothesis, then testing, observing, analyzing, and revising again. Step by step, they were approaching solving the mystery of flight. However, not everything went smoothly. The Wright brothers experienced serious disappointments and were dragged into deep demoralization. Existing aviation tables and theoretical calculations didn't reflect reality. Lift force values weren't holding up. Gliders weren't showing expected performance. This was a big problem. Finally, they made a radical decision. They decided not to trust anyone's data and to measure everything themselves from scratch. They returned to their workshop in Dayton and this time built a more advanced, extremely precise wind tunnel. They designed and tested more than 200 different wing profiles. They carefully measured each one, compared them, recorded their results. This patient, exhausting and scientific work ultimately gave them the most accurate and reliable aerodynamic data in the world at that time. In the summer of 1902, they went to Kitty Hawk again with their third, most advanced glider yet. This time, everything had changed. The glider was more balanced, control was much better, and flights were more successful than ever. They glided safely hundreds of times, performed skilled maneuvers over the wind. They had now solved the secret of controlling flight. It was time to turn humanity's centuries-old dream into reality: powered flight. The big problem was this: there was no suitable engine on the market. No engine had the necessary characteristics. Automobile engines of the period were too heavy, weak, and cumbersome. They couldn't provide the thrust needed to take off. Upon this, the Wright brothers decided to design their own engine from scratch. They clearly explained the technical requirements to their talented machinist Charlie Taylor, who worked in their workshop. The engine would be light, compact, but also powerful. After just 6 weeks of intensive work, Charlie produced an aluminum block engine with 12 horsepower and weighing only 70 kilograms. This was an extraordinary engineering achievement for that period. But the engine alone wasn't enough. There was another big problem: the propeller. At that time, no one really knew how to make an efficient airplane propeller. The Wright brothers decided to solve this problem with their own methods too. They thought of the propeller as essentially a rotating wing and applied wing aerodynamics principles. After months of calculations, experiments, and discussions, they designed an extremely efficient propeller beyond the period. Now all the components of flight were ready. In September 1903, the Wright brothers returned to Kitty Hawk. This time with them was their aircraft that would go down in history, the Flyer. Everything was ready. The wingspan was 12 meters. Total weight was only 330 kilograms. The engine was working, propellers were spinning, control systems appeared flawless. They had never been closer to that moment that would change human history. However, the first attempts didn't go as expected. The engine broke down, the propeller shaft broke. Everything was back to square one. The Wright brothers didn't give up. They patiently repaired, fixed deficiencies, tried again and again. But this time, nature also challenged them. Days of storms, violent winds, and unsuitable weather conditions postponed tests repeatedly. Still, they didn't give up. Silently, patiently, they waited for that perfect moment. And finally, the morning of Thursday, December 17th, 1903 came. The weather was freezing, the sky grey, wind blowing from the north. But this time conditions were suitable. That morning the Wright brothers were ready to crack open the door to the sky. It was about 10:30. Orville gathered his courage and settled into the Flyer's cockpit, assumed a horizontal position. Wilbur ran alongside, stabilized the wing, provided support. The engine started, a loud hum rose, propellers began spinning rapidly. The Flyer moved on the rail, gained speed, and then that magnificent moment came. The aircraft lifted off the ground, rose into the air. It glided in the air for 12 seconds, traveled 36 meters. Thus occurred the first powered, controlled, and sustained flight in human history. At that moment, the world was never the same again. On that day, December 17th, 1903, 4 historic flights were accomplished in total. The first flight was made by Orville. The aircraft stayed in the air for 12 seconds and traveled 36.5 meters. In the second flight Wilbur piloted, the flight lasted 8 seconds and advanced approximately 54 meters. In the third flight, Orville flew again, staying in the air for 15 seconds and traveling approximately 79 meters. In the fourth and final flight, Wilbur glided in the air for 59 seconds and covered 252 meters. That was the moment, a turning point in human history. Soaring in the sky, a dream for centuries, had now become reality. Two ordinary bicycle mechanics had accomplished the impossible, challenged science, and changed the world forever. Unfortunately, the world didn't immediately understand or believe them. Newspapers either belittled the news or completely ignored it. Scientists were skeptical. Some thought the success might be a hoax. Famous astronomer Simon Newcomb had recently said, "Mechanical human flight is impossible," and with wounded pride didn't want to believe it. The Wright brothers paid no attention to all this skepticism and belittlement because they had lived the truth firsthand. They had felt flight, experienced the power of wind on their wings. In the following years, they continued to improve their aircraft, patiently enhanced it. In 1904 and 1905, they made hundreds of flights in Huffman Prairie Meadow, near Dayton. Longer flights, better control, more reliable engines. In 1905, Wilbur flew for 40 minutes and covered 39 kilometers. This was no longer a toy, it was a real aircraft. In 1908, the world finally noticed the Wright brothers, understood their achievement. Their demonstration flights in France literally shocked Europeans. Wilbur stayed in the air for hours, performed elegant maneuvers, drew figure eights, and controlled the aircraft masterfully. This was no longer just flying. It was an art performance in the air. The French applauded, standing in enthusiasm. Newspapers carried it in headlines, and the world realized it had changed. The Wright brothers were now known worldwide, called heroes. The U.S. military also finally began to take interest and seriously ordered the first military aircraft from the Wright brothers. The age of air power had quietly begun. But success always came with pain. In 1909, during a military demonstration flight, Orville had a terrible accident. The aircraft lost control in the air and crashed. His passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, lost his life. Orville was seriously injured, and his legs were broken. But he recovered and courageously continued flying. Wilbur suddenly fell ill in May 1912. He contracted typhoid, his fever rose, and his condition rapidly deteriorated. On May 30th, 1912, at only 45 years old, he passed away. Orville was devastated by the pain of losing his brother, his partner, and his closest friend. But he continued the Wright brothers' work, protected their honor, and grew the company. In 1915, he sold the company and retired, withdrawing. Orville lived for 36 more years after this. On January 30th, 1948, at age 76, he closed his eyes to life. Throughout his life, he personally witnessed the transformation in the sky. 45 years had passed since that small, 12-second first flight. Humanity had now exceeded the speed of sound. Jets soared in the sky. The dream of the first powered flight had turned into a revolutionary reality. The Wright brothers' legacy is immortal. They didn't invent the airplane from nothing. The idea of flight had existed since ancient times. But they were the first to achieve controlled, powered, practical, sustained flight. They rigorously used the scientific method, systematic experiments, precise measurements, meticulous recording, patient improvements. They conducted wind tunnel tests, collected their own aerodynamic data. They weren't just dreaming inventors, but disciplined scientists. And most importantly, they never gave up, never quit. They experienced countless failures, had accidents, faced skeptics. Their hopes were crushed. But they trusted each other infinitely, believed in their dreams, continued working. Two ordinary bicycle mechanics, two brothers from a small town, realized humanity's oldest dream. The sky was no longer a limit. It was a new beginning, an infinite possibility. If you enjoy discovering these kinds of inspiring stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share what you think about the Wright brothers in the comments. In our next video, we'll tell the story of another person who left their mark on history. See you. Goodbye.